love mofongo. Mofongo is a Puerto Rican dish, traditional dish, that's made by frying and then smashing green plantains, then adding garlic, olive oil, chicharrón, which is fried pork skins. It's super delicious. Very, very, very good. Maybe you're looking at this image if you haven't had mofongo before and thinking, that looks like some really heavy deep fried food. When I look at mofongo, I see creativity, ingenuity, and fusion. I see indigenous ingredients and African techniques. I see Spanish colonialism and US imperialism. I see my history. And each of you has a food history. Doesn't matter if your family's from Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Bulgaria, or Ireland. Our foods map our history and tell stories that often go untold. They tell the stories of migrations, of diasporas, of colonies and tribes. And they also tell more intimate stories about our families and how they grow and change over time. You can read these stories in baklava, in gumbo, in chop suey, because every dish has a story. I was born in Puerto Rico, but I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, actually in the suburbs outside of Atlanta, Georgia. There are actually millions of Puerto Ricans across the United States, more actually on the mainland than on the island, though maybe not so many here in New Hampshire. And Puerto Ricans here on the mainland, we're an immigrant community who aren't really immigrants. You see, I was born a citizen, but like so many other immigrants, I grew up feeling like an outsider. My customs, what I ate, were really strange to those around me. When I was in grade school and kids would send their parents to class with holiday cookies or cakes, my mom sent me to class with arroz con dulce, a coconut rice pudding filled with cinnamon and raisins. Growing up in the South was tough. There were very few Latinos in Georgia at the time, and I never met any Puerto Ricans. I met a few. And my Spanish was pretty terrible, but we did speak Spanish at home and at Catholic Mass on Sundays. Otherwise, I didn't see my culture reflected around me. There was no salsa music blaring from cars, no guava pastries in the bakeries. So I grew up pretty Southern, saying y'all and ma'am, eating cheese grits and fried okra. Over time, I grew more connected to the South, and today, I'm proud to claim my Southern identity. I struggled with my Latina identity in the South, but I also struggled with my Southern identity in Puerto Rico. Growing up, I went to Puerto Rico often and would spend whole summers with my grandmother, Tata. But when I would go to Puerto Rico, I woke up most mornings feeling miserable, hot, and sweaty. The heat was incredibly difficult for me. I was a super American kid, and I needed air conditioning. And so with my Spanish also, again, growing up not being so great, I couldn't make friends, and most of those summers I was really, really lonely. And I felt like an outsider there too. I didn't belong in Puerto Rico. I didn't belong in Atlanta, Georgia. I didn't know where I belonged. But my grandmother, Tata, was an amazing cook and introduced me to the flavors that I'm obsessed with today. And as I ate these flavors and tasted more of them, the more and more I felt at home. So Puerto Rican food became my tether to the island. As you can imagine, the more I ate, the rounder I got. Actually, my mom used to say that I looked like a meatball with legs when I came home. But I wasn't just putting on pounds in Puerto Rico. I was also learning about the ingredients and flavors I needed to make these foods at home. Eight years ago, Tata was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She struggled with dementia, at times forgetting the names of her children and grandchildren, and often seeing things that weren't there. She also couldn't cook anymore and couldn't chop. She was constantly burning things and would confuse everyday herbs like culantro and oregano. She once put a whole can of soup in the microwave. But she still loved to eat, and I cooked for her every chance I got. A couple of years ago, I got my hands on her 1962 copy of the traditional Puerto Rican cookbook, Cocina Criolla, which was her favorite cookbook. Think of it as the Puerto Rican joy of cooking. So I started cooking my way through this cookbook, sort of Julie and Julia style, as a way to honor her, but also because I really wanted to soak up every bit of taste memory that she had, to know what made her smile and say que rico, or frown and say guacala. Cocina Criolla was published in 1954 and has been republished 68 times with very, very few additions. It's still widely used and really popular. Ask any Puerto Rican you know and they probably have a copy. But in many ways, the Julie and Julia comparison doesn't quite translate. We all know who Julia Child was. She's famous, she's trained in French kitchens, she had a fierce, loyal following. Carmen Aboy Valdeuli, the author of Cocina Criolla, she was a self-taught home cook. She didn't have a TV show or a newspaper column. She wasn't a celebrity. And what you see in her book are recipes that reflect the ingredients and dishes of her time. Cocina Criolla isn't the joy of cooking, or even the Betty Crocker cookbook. And as I started cooking my way through it, I ran into challenges. First, the recipes are incredibly time-consuming. Many of them require marinating meats for 2 days in advance, followed by hours of slow cooking. I'm not a homemaker, I have a full-time job, and so coming home at the end of a long day to start a dish that takes 4 hours, simultaneously overheating my apartment, using 5 or 6 pots and pans, every surface in my kitchen and dining area, and sometimes the bathroom, which happens to be in my kitchen, only to have dinner ready 4 hours later at midnight. It wasn't working. Next, Puerto Rican, second, most of the dishes in Cocina Criolla are really heavy and fattening. They require a lot of lard and olive oil and deep frying, and there are almost no vegetables. Where there are vegetables, they're either canned or cooked to smithereens. But in many ways, this kind of food reminded me of food from an area I'm much more familiar with, the South. Now, we know that Southern food today is not just fried chicken and macaroni and cheese, but a lot of traditional Southern food involves butter, deep frying, and putting bits of fatty pork into just about everything to add flavor. This ends with food that is fattening, filling, sticks to your ribs, starchy, food that will sustain people that work hard, like farmers and laborers. And here's where it started to really make sense to me, and I began to understand how the two places where I had grown up were connected. Puerto Rico became a Spanish colony more than 500 years ago. The indigenous Tainos were quickly enslaved or killed, and huge communities of African slaves were brought in to work the fields and sugar plantations. The indigenous Tainos shared their ingredients and their styles of cooking, and the African slaves also brought ingredients and techniques from their own home countries, things like plantains, cultivating rice, grinding spices into flavorful pastes, and frying meat in oil to preserve it. And many of these techniques and ingredients are visible in Puerto Rican food today. If you haven't had Puerto Rican food before, you might assume that it's like Spanish food because of its colonial history. And it does have a lot of Spanish influence. You see it in things like bean stews with chorizo and potato and egg tortilla española. But most Puerto Rican food is nothing like food from other Spanish colonies, like Mexico or Peru or Argentina. It's an absolute hybrid with just as much in common with Spain as with Jamaica and the American South. In Spain, you might see something like gazpachos or delicately flavored paellas, but in Puerto Rico, we have rice and beans and boiled yuca. In Puerto Rico, this story has yet another chapter. Mofongo, which is such a fusion of Puerto Rican, Spanish, indigenous, and African ingredients and flavors, being stuffed into a turkey. It's sometimes called a pavochon because it's seasoned like a traditional lechon or pork roast. I grew up in Puerto Rico in the South, but today I live in East Harlem, or El Barrio, an iconic Puerto Rican neighborhood in Manhattan. In the summers, the streets are filled with salsa music and piragüeros riding push carts selling coconut shaved ice. And the grocery stores in my neighborhood have things I've only ever seen in Puerto Rico, like salt cod, guava paste, annatto seeds, and every kind of Goya product you can imagine. So these dishes have taken on a new life for me. I grew up cooking and eating them with my family, but today I make them in my tiny kitchen with my friends and loved ones. I've made dozens of recipes out of Cocina Criolla, and each time I do more and more experimenting. I recently made tembleque, a type of coconut panna cotta that's so popular in Puerto Rico, it's even made in instant pudding form. I used a Cocina Criolla recipe and made coconut milk from scratch, and it was totally worth it. I've also taken this project completely out of my New York kitchen, into other people's kitchens. In November, I hosted a supper club at Lucky Luna, a Mexican-Taiwanese restaurant in Brooklyn. I designed a menu of heavily adapted recipes from Cocina Criolla that included things like a chayote and green bean salad with avocado, and bao, or steamed buns, with pernil and ajili mojili sauce. And I'm not the only one longing to adapt and evolve Puerto Rican cuisine. Chefs in Puerto Rico today are starting to look really closely at its African and indigenous ingredients. And farmers are starting to grow things that have never grown in Puerto Rico before. Because Puerto Rico, like Cuba and the Dominican Republic, was cultivated for sugarcane, not kale. Tata passed away on March 7th. I recently found a note from her where she said that she was proud of me, that she loved me, and that it made her so happy that I liked to cook like she had. She sent it in the mail along with one of her other favorite Puerto Rican cookbooks. Today, I'm working on a cookbook with recipes from this project, in part to honor her in each of its pages, but also to share this incredible gift she gave me of connecting to my history and culture through cooking. And it all started for me when I got curious about one dish. So I hope that y'all will all get curious about your own dishes. Is there something your mom always made that you thought was great and you didn't know why? What's in that brown sauce that your dad puts on ribs? Does your grandma make really great Indian food, even though she's Greek? And just how does your mom make the best flan you've ever had? When you go home today, and the next time you're at a holiday meal with your family, I hope you'll think back, share what you've learned with your family, and start to build a deeper understanding of how what you eat is so much more than what you like, what tastes good, or what you ate growing up. What we eat says so much about where we're from, and even more about who we want to be.